Well, Joshua chapter 3. On the one hand, the action at the heart of this chapter tonight is very, very straightforward, and yet it's very complicated and difficult. God is going to take almost 2 million people, men, women, and children with their cattle and their luggage across a fast-moving river. On Friday evening, when we went to meet Javiera and Christian and Samuel at the airport, they came in from Chile, and they'll be here studying at McGill for 2 or 3 years. They had quite a bit of luggage. And we were very, very grateful for those little buggies with the rollers, with the casters on it. The children of Israel did not have buggies with coasters, with all of their luggage to cross the Jordan River, and it likely would have not have gone very well on the dried-out riverbed. And just to make it even more challenging, this happens at the end of the spring, at a moment of the year when the river is at its overflowing height. It's overflowing its banks. The Jordan is at its fastest moving, at its widest, and at its deepest. And you're tempted to ask a question, why would God do this then? Why not do it during the dry season? Why not do it a little bit earlier in the winter? Why not do it later in the fall? Well, there's a reason for that. This is the moment when the promised land is beginning to bear fruit and to be ready for harvest. God wanted his people to get into the promised land at the peak of harvest, when food was ready, when the vegetables were ready, when the fruit was ready, when there was a harvest ready to pick. In fact, we're told that just a few weeks after crossing into the promised land, after crossing the Jordan River, the manna stops and they begin to eat the fruit in the harvest of the land. So in human terms, not the best time of the year, but God knows what he's doing. The action of the chapter could be described in just 4 or 5 lines, in just 1 or 2 verses. But God stretches it out. And he wants the people who were there and the people who are reading chapter 3 to fully absorb what's happening. So God's going to be a little repetitive. He's going to give the instructions. He's going to give the instructions again, and then the same words will be repeated as they carry out the instructions, and then after they've carried out the instructions, it's going to be repeated one more time just for good measure. God is gradual, he's meticulous, and he's laying out his plan. We're going to read the chapter in just 3 sections. The first 6 verses tell us about the preparation for crossing the Jordan. Verses 7 to 13 give us the final instructions. And in verses 14 to 17, just in 2 or 3 verses, 2 million people cross the Jordan River into the promised land onto dry ground. Joshua chapter 3, and beginning at verse 1. Then Joshua rose early in the morning. By the way, that's one of the most frequent things we're told about Joshua. Repeatedly we're told Joshua got up early in the morning. My mother always told me that the world belongs to those who get up before anybody else. Then Joshua, and then of course I won't go there. Then Joshua rose up early in the morning, and they set out from Shittim. You remember that was the place from which they sent out the spies. That was the place at which they'd had trouble the last time. The last time that they set out from Shittim, they didn't head into the promised land. They headed back the other way, back into the desert. This time they're going the right direction. This is the last rest stop before you cross the Ontario border when you're on the 401. You know what that feels like? That's the last rest stop before the promised land. The last time they got here, they turned around and headed back to the desert, and this time they're heading in. And they came to the Jordan, he and all the people of Israel, and lodged there before they passed over. At the end of 3 days, the officers went through the camp and commanded the people, as soon as you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God being carried by the Levitical priest, then you shall set out from your place and follow it. Yet there shall be a distance between you and it about 2,000 cubits in length, about half a mile. Do not come near it, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Now understand, they've been turning around in circles for 40 years. They've seen the same scenery around and round and round for 40 years, and God says, this is new territory. Pay attention. You need to use Waze or GPS. You need to know the way you're going. Do not come near the ark, in order that you may know the way you shall go, for you've not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, this is the first time Joshua speaks directly to them, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, "Take up the ark of the covenant and pass on before the people." So they took up the ark of the covenant and went before the people. So the people have come, they have camped along the edge of the Jordan River. There was a process whereby they did this. We've got that repeated for us several times through the 5 books of Moses. When the 12 tribes camped, there was a way they camped, there was an order in which they camped, there was a place where the tabernacle went, and the tribes were all sitting in order. And so as they camp by the edge of the Jordan River, when the time comes, the Levitical priests will carry the Ark of the Covenant. You remember that was the box that contained 3 things. It contained the tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments, not the tablets that God had made. Those got broken, literally and figuratively. They contained the ones that Moses had replaced them with. They contained a little jar full of manna, and they contained Aaron's rod that had budded, that affirmed his priesthood. And so this box, the Ark of the Covenant, was carried. There were little loops on the side, and the Levites would put 2 carrying poles through them, and the Levites would sit them on their shoulders. The box was about a meter high, a meter wide, and about 1.5 meters deep, and they would carry this. And Joshua says to the people, "You're sitting camped where you are, you're ready to go, you're all packed, you're ready to cross, and so when the time comes, wait and watch, and when you see the Ark of the Covenant go by, get ready, carry your things, keep a distance about 1/2 mile so you can see it ahead of you, and you will follow into the Jordan River." This time, the preparation includes 2 things. You remember we noted that when Joshua first made the preparations, God told him to prepare. In 3 days we're going to cross. He told them to pack their bags. This time, there's some spiritual preparation. And part of the spiritual preparation, strangely, God has them come and park at the edge of the Jordan for 3 days. Now, I've got to tell you, I'm not sure, humanly speaking, that this is good leadership skills. There are times where I've had to lead our kids through difficult moments and tricky things. There's times where I've had to lead a company through moments of uncertainty. And there are times as a leader where I'm not sure that it's wise to give the people you're leading all the information. Sometimes some of the scary stuff, you kind of keep it from them a little bit. The Jordan is rough, it's wild, it's full, it's overflowing its banks. It's at its widest at this time of the year, and they're not crossing at the narrowest point of the Jordan. Having them sit there on the bank of the Jordan for 3 days gave the people of Israel a chance to understand just how large the challenge was. I can imagine as they sat there over 3 days, some of them with cattle, some of them with young cattle that had just been born, some of them with young children that they had to carry, some of them with luggage that they could barely carry on their shoulders. As they sat there for 3 days, there was time for them to think, wait. I'm going to have to take my kids and my luggage and my cattle and my goat and my sheep and my wife and my grandparents, and we're going to have to cross this river here. God wanted them to know how wide the challenge was. He wanted them to know what was ahead of them. We tend to be a little rosy sometimes. We tend not to want to know all the bad news. But God wanted the Israelites to realize just how daunting the challenge was. I'll never forget when I was working with one of the young student pastors at the Snowden Korean church. He had been struggling to get his paperwork and his visa for he and his wife and his kids. And the visa had expired. He was waiting for it to be renewed. And the immigration officials were taking their time, as they often do here in Quebec. And he called me one day and he said, "I have what I think is good news." He said, "The immigration officials called me. And they asked me to come downtown with all my paperwork and to show up at the Federal Immigration Office." And he says, "I think this is good news. They asked me to come with all our paperwork, with all of our vital stuff, and to bring my wife and my kids." And I said, got to tell you, when they do that, that means that from the office, they're taking you to the airport. So he said, "What do we do?" I said, "You do 2 things. You show up like they asked you to, and you pray like you've never prayed before in your life." And we prayed, and we don't know what went wrong. They showed up, and they got forgotten. They sat there in the office all day. They had an appointment at 9 o'clock, and they called me at 5:30, and he said, the office closes in 15 minutes, and we haven't been through yet. And I said, well, go up to the counter and ask. And they did. And they said, oh, yeah, we have an envelope for you. You just had to pick up an envelope. And in the envelope was a renewed visa for 3 years instead of 1 year. And I'm still sure that somebody made a mistake. They weren't eligible for Medicare health insurance, but somebody decided to give it to them anyway. So I don't know if that's my prayers that did that, but the river was pretty wide, and God pulled something that we weren't expected. Joshua speaks to the people for the first time. Since he has become leader, every time he has spoken to the people through the leaders. This is the first time that they're all assembled together, and Joshua himself is speaking to them. Now, I don't know how he did this. Hundreds of thousands of people, 1.5 million, 1.6 million by our calculation, and apparently he addressed them all. Either he's got a better set of lungs than I do, or he stood, or somebody repeated what he said as he spoke, as they would often do. So he speaks to them, and this time the preparations he gives them are very, very spiritual. He doesn't just say, pack your bags and get ready to go, we're crossing the Jordan tomorrow. He says, consecrate yourselves. Consecrate yourselves. This is going to be a spiritual moment, Joshua says. God is going to do wonders among you. You're going to see God at work. One of the advantages of serving in a multi-ethnic congregation is that as North Americans, there's little everyday things that we take for granted that in other countries are special moments. I'd been here for 3 or 4 months when a couple called me and told me, we've just moved into our new house and we're ready for you to come and bless the house. And I thought, okay, never done that before. They didn't teach us this in seminary in Montreal. This is not something we do in North America, but apparently in the Caribbean and Jamaica and in several African countries, this is what you do. When you buy a new house after you've moved in, you call the pastor and you bless the house. And so I went online and I found some house blessing liturgy and found some neat passages in the Gospels where Jesus is in a kitchen, where he's in a bedroom, where he's in the den, and as we went from room to room, and in each room in the house, we read a piece of Scripture together. We prayed. That was new for me. But we don't do this, do we? We have moments of everyday life, and we think that these are everyday, ordinary moments that God doesn't have a part in. Joshua says this is a special moment. We're not just crossing a river. God is going to do something. Prepare yourselves. Consecrate yourselves. Verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. And as for you, command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, when you come to the brink of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. And Joshua said to the people of Israel, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you, and that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth is passing over before you into the Jordan. Now therefore take 12 men from among the tribes of Israel, one each tribe a man. And when the soles of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off from flowing, and the waters coming down from above shall stand in one heap. Now I promised that when we started into Joshua that I would tell you if ever there was a historical inaccuracy or a historical problem. In all of the lists that were provided in Joshua about all of the people that they move out of the land, that they conquer, there's 23 different people groups that are listed. They never list all 23. Each time there's a list, like we have it tonight, almost every time they pick 7 of the 23. 7 is the number for perfection, I guess. But typically at random, they pick 7 of the 23 and they give them every time a list is given. So this is not an exhaustive list. There's 23 different nations that will be displaced before the children of Israel. But he picks about 7 of them tonight, and they're smattering. If you look at where they live, some live in the south, some in the north, some in the east, some in the west. And Joshua's picked at random. He says a few here, a few there, a couple over here, a couple over here. And he said basically all of these people, the Lord will send them before you. Now, almost all of the nations on the list, 6 out of the 7, are attested to in extra-biblical sources. We find them either in literature or in archaeological finds, and sometimes in both. 6 of the 7 are well attested to, and we know that Joshua was right. They're at the right place at the right time because we find other indications of this. And in fact, in some of the literature and the archaeological digs that we find that somewhere around the right period of time, these people ran into some trouble. And we put 2 and 2 together, and we realized the trouble they ran into was the children of Israel as they came into the promised land. The only group of the 7 to which we don't have outside testimony is a little group called the Girgashites. The Girgashites are mentioned 3 times in the Scriptures. They're mentioned in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles 1 as one of the people groups that comes out of Canaan. And they're mentioned here. They're not mentioned anywhere else. And as Joshua goes through the promised land and they wipe out all of these nations, all of the other 6 nations are mentioned. They come into battle with it, but the Girgashites aren't mentioned again. Our presupposition is that the Girgashites were a small people group. They were not particularly significant, and so we don't have a lot of other details. So that's as close as we've come to a problem text so far. The Girgashites just aren't mentioned anywhere else. There's not a contradiction. There's not a problem with them. Just so you know, I promised I would tell you if ever in the text there was a weird, and that's one of the first weird little things. The Girgashites, this is the only place they're mentioned. Now, the heart of what's happening here comes to us in verses 10 and 11. Joshua uses 2 expressions that are really striking, that are not frequent in the Scriptures. He begins with this in verse 10. He looks at the people, he calls them close, and he says, now listen, open your ears, hear me good. What I'm about to tell you is very, very important. In verse 10, Joshua said, here is how you shall know that the living God is among you. Interesting thought, eh? What if I told you at Cote one Sunday morning, here's how you're going to know that the living God is among you? Wouldn't you like to know for sure? The people are headed into Canaan. They're headed into the promised land. They're going to fight off against all of these people. It's going to be scary. Some of them are powerful. There's fortified cities. And Joshua says, pay attention. Today, the living God is going to give you the proof that when you face off against these people, He's up to the task and everything's going to be okay because He's powerful enough to take them out and to bring you in. To prove to them that this will happen, God is going to take them across the Jordan River. Now, do you understand why God had them cross at a wide spot at the spring, when it was difficult, when it was hard? What if they'd waited till later in the winter when the Jordan was almost dry? And what if they've gone to a spot where during the winter when it's almost dry, the Jordan is just a couple feet across and you can almost put a plank and cross? What if God had brought them across the Jordan River there and said, oh, you see, the Lord took you across a plank on a river that's 2 feet wide and 6 inches deep. This is how powerful your God is. There's a reason God chose to have them cross the Jordan at this point of the year, at this place, at this moment when it was difficult, because they needed to know what God could do. They needed to know that they were up against this impossible task that was happening only because of the power of God. And what they see as they cross the Jordan is proof that the living God is among them. And then the second thing in verse 11 that he tells them to give them confidence, he uses an expression that appears for the first time. The Ark of the Covenant is typically always just called the Ark of the Covenant. There's just 3 places in the Old Testament where this expression is added. The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth. To the Jews so far, The Ark of the Covenant it's their little thing. It's this little box. Nobody else knows about it. It's just their thing. It's in the tabernacle. It's a private thing. The nations around them don't know about the Ark of the Covenant. They themselves know what the Ark of the Covenant represents. They know that it symbolizes the presence of God. They approach it with fear and trembling. Even now, as the Ark of the Covenant goes ahead of them, they have to keep a distance because they have to see where it's going, not to get lost and to know what way to go. But it's also out of reverence and fear because it represents the holiness of God. But so far, the Ark of the Covenant has just been sort of this thing for Israel. It's just for them. Joshua says, no more. This isn't just the Ark of the Covenant of God with Israel. This is the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth. The God who's represented by this Ark is not just your little family deity. He's not your little idol for you guys alone. This is the God of the whole earth. And how is he going to prove that he's the God of the whole earth? How is he going to prove that he's the God of the whole earth and he's more powerful than all of those nations? Because he's going to conquer the scariest thing that there was for the children of Israel. Big water. The God of the whole earth controls the flow of the water. Can stop the Jordan River. The living God. You're following the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth. I don't know if you remember in the Gospels, Jesus did a lot of things that impressed the disciples, but there's one thing that just blew their minds. The one moment when the disciples click and they realize they're in trouble. They're in the sea. They're in the middle of the storm. They get blown into the middle of the lake. Big water, big thundering water, big stormy water. They're as afraid as you can get. They're afraid they're going to die. And they wake Jesus up. And it's one of these moments where I've told you about this often, I know, I'm sorry, but it's one of these moments where we get his humanity and his divinity side by side. Jesus is human enough that he's exhausted and he falls asleep on the boat. Very, very human. And yet 30 seconds later, he stands, he doesn't flail his arms, he doesn't scream and yell, just with his voice, peace, be still. And he controls the sea and the storm. And it's at that moment, remember the disciples they say, who is this, that even the winds and the water listen to him? This was proof of power to the Israelites, controlling the water. They are following the living God, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth. And how does he prove that he's the Lord of the covenant of all the earth? He can stop the Jordan in its tracks. Verse 14. So when the people set out from their tents to pass over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as soon as those bearing the Ark had come as far as the Jordan, and the feet of the priest bearing the Ark were dipped in the brink of the water. Now he adds a parenthesis so you don't forget, now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. He wants you to remember, it's not just the rinky-dinky little water, it's the stream, the flood water. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away. Now, he uses a word that's never used for water. In fact, he uses the same word for water as he uses for the Levitical priests. The Levitical priests, they come, they dip their toes in the water, they stand there, and they stand still. This is not a word that's normally used for water. Understand? Water doesn't normally stand still. But pointedly, in a play on words in the Hebrew, he says, as still as the priests stood, as they came in, put their feet in the water, and they stood still and they didn't move, he uses the same word in the Hebrew for the water. The water just stopped. It didn't flow, didn't move, it didn't shake, it just stopped. It's like it was frozen. And it rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is beside Zarethan. And those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the sea salt, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jericho. Now the priest bearing the ark of the covenant of the Lord stood firmly on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel was passing over on dry ground until all the nation finished passing over the Jordan. Now I like the description of the crossing of the Jordan because it reminds me of the descriptions of the miracles of Jesus. The wording is sparse, it's specific, and scientific. This is not overblown fake news. This isn't reported guesstimates with hearsay. This is an eyewitness account. Just the bare details. When Jesus heals a blind man, he was blind. He'd been blind for 40 years. The parents knew he was a blind man. He's healed. He can see. There you go. Miracle. That's it. There's no fanfare. There's no party. There's no CTV news with the, it's just, this is the way it is. And very, very sparsely, with just a couple of words, the priest went in, feet in the water, water stopped. This is where the water stopped. This is where the water kept flowing. This is how long the water stood still. They crossed through. It was done. There you go. Bingo. Tells you exactly what happened. Tell you where it happened. That's it. So they've crossed the Jordan River. It seems like that easy. And it's so understated. 1.5 million and more men, women, children with their cattle and their luggage and everything have just crossed this powerful Jordan River at one of its widest spots, at one of the busiest times of the year when it overflows its banks. Now, they crossed across from Jericho. I'm sure there's people in Jericho who were spying them, watching them come. Rahab, last chapter, said they're already afraid. I tell you, they've got to be shaking in Jericho if they've seen this. So, what's the image here? Traditionally, a lot of Christian hymns and literature have portrayed the crossing of the Jordan as the moment of death when you and I as believers will step into heaven or the life hereafter. And a lot of the songs that we sing, that's it. When I die, I'm going to cross the Jordan, the river's going to be cold, I'm going to get to the other side, I'm going to get to the promised land. And I understand, and they're cool hymns and they're neat, but I disagree. For one thing, I hope that when you and I get to heaven, that we don't have to fight our way in. Imagine if when you get to heaven, there's a fortified city of Jericho, you've got to walk around it, bring the walls down, you've got to, I hope not. That's not the way I read the New Testament. In fact, the picture which the New Testament paints of heaven is a place of rest, and the rest that the Lord will have prepared for us. So if leaving Egypt is leaving the world. Egypt is the world of sin and immorality. I'm glad Richard Lansing's not here tonight. I'm sorry, Richard, if you're listening online, but Egypt is, leaving Egypt is leaving the world. You leave the world behind when you leave Egypt. You cross the Red Sea and you begin the Christian life. And then the period when you're crossing the desert, it's that initiation process of the Christian life. If the people had listened to God, they would have gotten across the desert probably in about 12 to 18 months, 2 years at the most, and then into the promised land. But they spent 40 years turning around in the desert. The crossing of the Jordan doesn't mark the moment when we die and go to heaven. It marks the moment when we finally enter the victorious Christian life. When we finally start living up to who we're supposed to be. And the sad thing is that most Christians spend their whole Christian life wandering in the desert, trying to figure it out, not wanting to take a risk, remembering how good Egypt used to be. There are cucumbers and onions. We want to go back. And no, we don't want to go. We want to go back. And sitting on the fence, turning around in the desert. So crossing the Jordan is stepping into the victorious Christian life. It's a Christian life the way it was meant to be. Hard, demanding, challenging, but victory is possible because we just walk in and claim the victory through the power of God. So that's lesson number one. I hope I haven't burst your bubbles tonight. But when you cross the Jordan, that's not the moment you get to the other side. That's the moment when you really start living your Christian life the way it was meant to be. Fighting some battles, taking on the enemy, leading in victory the way you're called to do it, instead of wandering around the desert lost trying to figure it out. There's a second lesson that's at the heart of the text tonight. And I kind of like this one because I'm visual this way. The crossing of the Jordan River was very, very different than the crossing of the Red Sea. When the people got to the edge of the Red Sea, the Egyptian army was coming up behind them, the Red Sea was ahead of them, the desert was on the other side, the mountain was on the other side, and so they were stuck there. And as the Egyptian army comes, God gives Moses instructions. Moses raises his staff over the Red Sea, the wind blows, the Red Sea opens, and then the people cross on dry ground. Didn't do that this time. God says, trust me, put your toes in the water, and when you put your toes in the water, Jordan's going to open. It's going to stop. I don't know about you, but Joshua and God doesn't say what's going to happen. The first couple of times the instructions are given, God just says the Levites are going to carry the ark and they're going to stand in the Jordan. You know, if I was the Levitical priest on duty that day, I would have said, I think I have a cough. Bob, why don't you take my spot, Because I don't know about this thing. It's a pretty wide river. Water's moving pretty fast. And God doesn't say what's going to happen. It just says, the priest is just going to go and walk into, and I'll take care of the rest. But nothing happened until they put their toes in the water. God asks us to do things sometimes, and we want it all figured out before it starts. We want the Jordan to stop. We want the riverbed to dry out. We want a handrail to guide us across. We want the spotlights. We want the map. We want the GPS and the Waze. We want to know, and we want to know where we're going to stop to use the bathroom and where the first meal break's going to be. And God says, you know what? Just put your toes in the water. Just put your toes in the water. Just as soon as you put your toes in the water, I'll take care of the rest. Lesson number 3. The event tonight, it sounds so ordinary that you can miss the huge spiritual element of what's happening here. I think I've told you before about the first thing I remember ever watching on television. Early in July of 1969, I was about 4 years old. My mom and dad, who had never had a TV, went to the local TV rental plot, and for the princely sum of $2 a month, they rented a 14-inch black and white television that got 3 channels. And on the evening of the 20th of July, 1969, the black and white TV was on. It didn't matter what channel, because it was the same thing on all of the channels. And we saw Neil Armstrong walk down a little ladder and set foot on the surface of the moon for the first time. I remember. It's the first thing I ever saw on TV, and it's still with me to this day. And you remember the words that he used. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Now, he got the wording wrong when he was there. They told him ahead of time what he was supposed to say, and he remembered it wrong, and he made a mistake. He talks about it in his biography. But you understand, for him, it was just a step. The last rung of the ladder was about 12 to 13 inches. They thought that the ladder was going to sink down a little lower, and so that last rung was a little too high up. He had to jump down. It was supposed to be literally a small step, but he jumped down, and he almost missed his footing and almost tumbled. And he takes that little step, and he says, it's just one little step for me, but this is a massive leap forward. For over 600 years, since God had made the first promise to Abraham, God had told Abraham and all his descendants, this land is yours. One day your descendants will be there. I'm going to bring you there, and in that land there's some neat stuff that's going to happen. You're going to start a new country. There's going to be the city of Jerusalem. There's going to be a royal line. Out of it, our royal line is going to come somebody who's going to bless all the kingdoms of the world. All of this depends on, at some point, those promises that have been made to Abraham and his descendants to come true. For 600 years, they've heard the promise, heard the promise, heard the promise, repeated the promise, heard the promise, heard the promise. Today, the promise is fulfilled. As you know, Bob and his wife and the kids and their luggage, they walk across the Jordan, they take this step, and history has been made. 600 years of God's promises have suddenly been fulfilled. God's plan of redemption has taken this huge, huge step forward. His children are in a land that is there, that will be the land of promise. I think it's very significant that God chooses for this to happen without fanfare. There's no horse-drawn carriages. There's no trumpets blowing. There's no big party, no celebration. They just walk. The river dries up and they just walk, and here we are. I'm in the promised land. 600 years of the promises of God fulfilled. We've taken this next massive step forward. You and I, we think about our little lives in little increments. What am I going to eat for lunch today? Am I going to go to church or not? What job will I take? Do I take the job at $8 an hour or the job at $11 an hour? Do I marry? And we make what we assume to be these little tiny, insignificant decisions, and yet each one of them are these loaded spiritual moments that are part of God's outworking plan. They didn't just cross the Jordan. They just left the wilderness and stepped into the promised land. 600 years of history and promise suddenly fulfilled. What a momentous day. What a momentous day. Would that we would recognize those moments. Would that we would recognize the sacredness and the holiness and the spiritual things that happen in these little, insignificant, ordinary moments of life. They haven't just stepped across the little river. They've crossed the Jordan into the promised land. Father, we thank you for these moments in our lives when you use us as broken individuals, as simple people, to take these little steps one at a time that work out your sovereign plan. Thank you for using us this way. Teach us to trust you. Father, there's a couple of people here, no doubt tonight, who are facing a situation where they're a little anxious and a little concerned, and they need to trust you enough to just put their toes in the water. Father, give them that courage. Give them that courage to put their toes in the water. Thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you for your steadfast love. Thank you that you are the promise-keeping God. We pray in Christ's name. Amen.